Welcome to Building My Legacy podcast. This podcast is designed for leaders and entrepreneurs who want to leave a legacy and will provide strategies that focus upon key elements for legacy creation, determining your desired impact and its benefit, increasing your legacy's reach by engaging key stakeholders, planning, prioritizing, and executing. Here's your host, Dr. Lois Sonstegard.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Building My Legacy podcast. I have with me today an incredibly special woman. Her name is Claire Diaz-Ortiz, and she has been recognized as one of 100 most creative people by Fast Company, and her story is just incredible. I think one of the things that every time I share this with people about you, Claire, and you're having gotten the Pope on Twitter, their eyes just get big and they go, how did she do that? So I want you to introduce yourself. You've done so much in social media. And the other thing I want to talk a little bit about today is ethics, because that's something that you're so interested in relative to social media, as I am. But please start with your story and share with us a little bit about your background first, and then your incredible story with the Pope.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And hello from Argentina. We are now officially in spring, and yet I'm all bundled up because I guess the climate has not realized the change of dates yet. So it's still pretty chilly down here. We're of course on opposite seasons. Yeah. So my background, I'm originally from California, and basically after graduate school, I ended up spending some time working as an editor and traveling around the world. And in that journey, just happened upon an orphanage in Kenya. I had gone to Kenya to climb a mountain. At the time, I was very athletic. I had climbed to the base camp of Mount Everest and run some marathons. And so I said, yeah, I want to go to Kenya and climb Mount Kenya. And so I went to Kenya with my best friend, and someone said, hey, if you're going to climb Mount Kenya, you should really stay at this particular guest house near the base of the mountain. And at the time, I did anything if it was free or nearly free. So I said, sure, that sounds like a great idea. And it turned out that the guest house was actually owned by an orphanage. So when we showed up, they asked us to, come have lunch with some of the orphanage elders and then meet some of the kids. And essentially, within about 2 hours, my life changed completely. I realized I didn't want to climb the mountain. I wanted to hang out at that orphanage for a week because I felt kind of this stirring and this feeling that maybe this was the next step in my journey. So I ended up staying at the orphanage for a week, and then that turned into a year. And then I started a nonprofit organization while I was there. And the way this all connects to Twitter is because the reason this nonprofit in 2006 got off the ground was because there was a little company called Twitter that was starting out in Silicon Valley, and Twitter had been created by the people who had started blogger.com. And I had a popular blog about my experience starting this nonprofit in an orphanage in Kenya. And the people at blogger.com took note. They started promoting it. And then they said, hey, we're starting this little thing called Twitter. Why don't you join and start tweeting about your experiences? So essentially, I became an early user tweeting about nonprofit work out in East Africa, and then turned into kind of this early Twitter influencer in the social good space. And within, I guess, a couple of years, ended up at the company using that kind of background of social good to see how we could really make Twitter as a company more proactive in terms of its positive effect on the world. And that was really Biz Stone, one of the co-founders of Twitter. That was really his mission. He wanted to see how we could do that in a proactive way. And at the time, the climate, we'll talk a little bit about ethics and social media later, but at the time, the climate was really open to that, and no one kind of saw social media as necessarily a bad thing, but everyone saw it as potentially a good thing, that we were going to prioritize it from a corporate standpoint to do more good, essentially, in democratizing information. So I spent about 5.5 years at Twitter, and it was really during that time that the Pope story all happened. And that was the result of something that I still look back on and think of as kind of a wow moment that I actually wasn't a part of. But there were some data scientists at Twitter just doing some kind of regular analysis of what was working on the platform and what wasn't working on the platform. And they came across something that they thought at the time was actually an anomaly, which was that all these Bible verses and quotes from pastors were getting a lot of reach, right? So these tweets were punching above their weight. So for example, you might have a pastor with 1,000 followers tweeting out a Bible verse, and it was getting a lot more engagement and a lot more retweets and sharing than, a celebrity with 100 times that many followers, right? And they kept seeing this across the board. And basically, they came to the very strange conclusion that for some reason, religious tweets were doing really well. And it turned out at the time, this was back in 2012, these were the most engaged tweets on the platform. So we said, okay, our theory of growth at Twitter at the time was all about kind of going after influencers and individual markets and trying to bring them on the platform and get them tweeting well. And then, the theory would be that they would sort of, all ships will rise, all tides. Is that how the saying goes?
Yeah.
And something like that. So we basically said, okay, well, who's the biggest religious leader that we could get out there? And, at the time it was Pope Benedict, would later become Pope Francis, using the same account. And so I spent the better part of a year working with the Vatican to onboard Pope Benedict. So to get the Vatican on board with the idea and then to get him actually on board the platform. And it was a really incredible experience. And when I look back on with so much fondness, I had such a great experience working with them as an organization. They were way more innovative and sort of forward thinking than I would have ever imagined. And ultimately, Pope Benedict got on Twitter. We had a live streamed event when he pressed tweet on his iPad. It took him a little minute. And so people kind of make fun of that in the YouTube video of him doing it. And I stood right next to him with my ponytail. My mom always laughed that I chose to wear a ponytail.
Just a minute, you went to the Vatican and stood next to him while he did this?
Yeah. So all the pictures about it, I'm next to him, and and that was great. And then, Pope Benedict shortly thereafter left his position and Pope Francis took over. And, ever since we've gotten a lot of tweets coming from the Vatican. So yeah.
That is amazing. And how did the response of the audience continue? Did it change at all, or did you see that you had an uptick because of what you did?
Sure. So, what we saw that was really interesting is, and I feel like this gets back to really the greatest criticism of the plan, right? So when I talk to the Vatican about, are you guys sure you really want to do this? And, what do you guys feel your doubts are about bringing the Pope on Twitter? They always said, hey, we came to you. We want to do this, which was absolutely true, right? But yes, we have real doubts, and here are our doubts. And they would say them, and they would say, people are going to say things like a Pope should not be on such a lowly platform as Twitter. But what they also said was that this was exactly what people said in 1950 when Vatican Radio launched. 1950 might not be the exact year, but in the 1950s, and it was the exact same thing. As people at the time felt, the Pope, this holy figure, we should not be able to hear him in our ears, in our homes, through our radios. And so it was really the similar response that they had faced 70, 65 years before. And so they expected that people would be upset, but they also knew that the overwhelming aim for them was for people to feel more connected, essentially, to their Pope. And one of the big ways they also did this was by launching the account in a number of different languages. I believe when we first launched, we launched in 8 languages, and then it quickly climbed up to more than 15 languages now. And so that's why for many years, he had the largest accounts on Twitter in terms of followers, simply because you would add up all the languages together. And doing it in different languages was obviously really important to make people feel that they were really connected. They were certainly not going to, have a Pope account only tweeting in Latin, for example, right?
Yeah. So how did it impact your life to have this connection? Was there an impact that this experience had on you personally?
Sure. I think for me, it was, obviously fascinating and just enlightening and interesting. And then at the same time, kind of funny. I'm married to an Argentine, and Pope Francis is an Argentine Pope. And so many of my family here in Argentina where I live were kind of like, why couldn't you have waited a few months? You met the wrong Pope, right? Because I met Pope Benedict and not Pope Francis. But I think beyond that, the biggest kind of impact it had on me was in understanding that you really never know who is innovative in this life. And I think so many people came to me, including, the way I came to the project, with this preconception that, the Vatican was going to be this slow moving institution that wasn't going to be able to keep up with the fast pace of, an early startup in Silicon Valley at the time. And the reality was that absolutely was not the case. I'm very open in saying I feel that the Vatican was pushing Twitter much more than Twitter was pushing the Vatican. I think the Vatican was more forward thinking and more innovative pretty much every step of the way. And I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. And I wish more people understood that. I think it's also just a great example of how, there's so many interesting organizations doing great things, and we often don't get to know about it because we kind of focus on the really flashy ones, the WeWorks and the Ubers of the world, when they're really great people doing amazing things everywhere. And sometimes, they even have stodgy names like the
Vatican. That's absolutely amazing. So from there, Claire, you have really begun a journey thinking about ethics relative to social media. I want to shift to that because right now it is getting so much attention. And interestingly, I think in a couple of the research papers that are coming out right now looking at what are the top things that corporations are looking at in terms of need, number 2 is ethics. How do we look at ethics and put it in place within our corporations? And what is it?
Yeah. Well, so I think that one of the early books I wrote was a book called Twitter for Good, Change the World One Tweet at a Time. And I published this book in 2009, and the book, did pretty well. But what I always like to say is, no one questioned that as a premise. It was a book about how you could use Twitter to change the world. Great, right? 10 years later, there's no way you could publish a book like that. You would get so much hate mail, hate tweets. You would get all kinds of stuff because, of course, in the last few years, we've really had this awakening in terms of what social media is, what it has done to our brains, to our adolescent girls, to our attention spans, and to our work lives, right? And so much of what we are facing today in terms of social media really has to do with what we didn't do 10, 12, 15 years ago when many of these platforms started, right? So one of my deep interests in terms of trying to remake the way we think about social media today is to bring more diverse voices into the conversation about reforming social media. One of the biggest problems I see is when you look back at the beginning of some of these big platforms, you see a lot of young white men created them, right? And I think that the reality is that, we have all seen in the last couple of years the limits of that. If you want a platform that can solve problems, that can help people, that can provide empathy, that can connect people together, that can truly democratize power. If you want a platform that can do all these complicated things and also protect people's privacy at the same time, well, you need a lot of smart people around the table. Right. And to get a lot of smart people around the table, you need those people to come from different backgrounds. And I think that's probably one of the biggest problems in terms of the founding of our larger social media companies today. And so that's why some of the people who are doing work to bring more diversity into tech are the people that I'm most interested in talking to and hearing from. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't good initiatives from other, single white males out there. Time Well Spent is a great initiative started by one of the early employees at Facebook. And basically it's a nonprofit organization that helps to shed light on some of the major issues of social media today. The founder he was one of the creators of the like button on Facebook. So he's very familiar with what you call it, kind of the gambling reflux of why you get so addicted to these platforms. And so he wants to help shape the future of social media. But I believe that what has to also happen is you need more diverse voices into that conversation. We just did not understand what we were creating. And in order to fix it going forward, you need different voices to help.
So how do you think different voices, I get diversity, different opinions. Is it largely sharing those ideas that's going to fix the problem? Or how do you see the different voices are going to change or shift what's happening?
Sure. Well, I think anyone who comes from a different background or a different perspective is going to bring different challenges to the table, right? So let me give you an example. One of the things we've seen in the last 2 years in terms of social media use is there have been a lot of studies coming out showing that basically social media use is linked or potentially linked, the studies are saying, to a rise in suicide rates in adolescent girls, right? And this is obviously something that no one could have predicted 15 years ago. However, had 15 years ago when these platforms been created, there been more diversity at the table, more women, more people of different ages, some of these issues might have been brought up in ways that they weren't at the time. Twitter co-founder Evan Williams has said this in an interview. Had we had more women engineers at the time, maybe something different would have happened. And I really believe kind of that is the case. And so now we are faced with having created or having been privy to the creation of some of these platforms that are causing a lot of problems, and we need to figure out how to remake them going forward. And I want to be clear, I believe social media is a really useful tool for brands. I have a new book that comes out now this month called Social Media Success for Every Brand, right? And I believe brands need to use social media. I believe social media is the most ubiquitous free marketing tool we have, and that you basically pretty much need to be on it if you want to reach your customers. But there are smart ways to do it, and there are stupid ways to do it. And the reality is that the platforms have been created in a way that it's very easy for us to use them in stupid ways.
So, Claire, as you look at this and you want to have a voice in dealing with or addressing the issue of how can we be more ethical, right? Mm-hmm. How do you see going about that?
Sure. Well, I think one of the big things on social media, I think there are a few different key policy things that can happen on these platforms that will really help things. One of those things is understanding that oftentimes women and minorities on these social media platforms need more protection. We see incredible hate speech and bullying happening, and that has been a constant challenge for platforms. A platform like Twitter was created as an open information platform, and they didn't, the idea was to not mitigate content, right? To not mediate, to let people share what they wanted to share. And the concept at the time was that the truth would rise to the top. And this is what we always used to say. So in a classic example, you had in 2010, the Haiti earthquake, right? And during the Haiti earthquake, this was really the first time that people really began to use Twitter in a case of a natural disaster. And many of them were using it in incredibly important, positive ways, right? Tweeting out the location of, an important facility that had clean water for local residents, or, tweeting out the connection for an individual who was suffering with the nonprofit who could provide them support. But obviously at the same time, there were some bad actors in it, right? Tweeting misinformation, creating hysteria, creating more problems, right? Even tweeting spam in the midst of all this. And so what you had and what we said at the time was that we didn't want to mediate the content as a platform, and instead we wanted to allow the truth to rise to the top. And I remember saying this in speech after speech when I was talking about the use of Twitter in situations of natural disaster. But I see now, a decade later, that I do believe, looking back, there was clearly more of a responsibility on behalf of the platform to do more, essentially.
So do you see that others in the various platforms are beginning to share that perspective? Or is there still a lot of work that needs to be done to get to the point where a serious dialogue can really take place?
I do see there's a lot of change. I think there are a lot of sort of small nonprofits and small activist groups that are growing in strength and growing in numbers and growing in kind of some of the influencers and Silicon Valley folks associated with their causes. So I think there's a lot of reason to hope. I think probably the biggest thing is seeing some of the leaders of these platforms today showing interest in making change, whether because of government pressure or because of, public pressure or the pressure from the users themselves. It doesn't really matter. The reality is that we are seeing some amount of change. And so I think there's a reason to hope.
Okay. So your dream would be what? I mean, you to me are one of the world's big dreamers, right? You have dreamed the Pope. You have dreamed really the use of social media in very interesting ways. So as you look at what are the ethical challenges, what would be your dream of what it could look like and people's accountability or responsibility relative to that?
I guess my dream would be that we can figure out a way, particularly to help teach our young people how to use social media well. I think the challenge that there are many challenges in all of this, but I think one of the gravest challenges is the fact that we really don't know the effects of what it's going to be for the next generation to have always been on these platforms. We see all the negative things about these platforms now, right? But we don't know the effects of how all those negative things are going to affect the individuals who have always been exposed to them. So I think my greatest dream would be that as we make strides in all these different areas of, increasing privacy and, decreasing harassment and bullying and all of those issues, I would like to see us find a way to directly connect those to protecting youth, essentially, who are just getting started on these platforms and just starting to live in this digital world.
Do you have a group that you are working with, either whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or any of the different platforms, where people can carry on this conversation further with you? Is there such?
I would love to talk with people about it on Twitter. I'm just at Twitter at Claire, Claire, and it's something I tweet about a lot and just try to engage in conversations with people about a lot. As I say, social media is a tool that, at least for now, it's here to stay, and I believe it is not only useful for brands, but it's also a great way for individuals to connect and build relationships. And I have many real friends that I have met through social media networks. I live far away from many of my friends and family in South America. And so being able to have these online tools that connect me with people at home is really essential. That said, I do think there is incredible opportunity for best practices and standards that can kind of protect us in ways we need to be protected, and certainly protect our, the next generation in ways that they need to be protected.
You know what? One of the things I would love to do is to create a group or a process where people who are really interested in this could come together and begin to share some of that, because I think it's in that process of sharing and thinking it out loud together that you really begin to have that influence that we're wanting to have. And you're absolutely right. We need to think about it for that next generation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, it's an incredible need right now.
So what I will do is let our audience know as we're able to take shape of that. And I'm going to talk further with you about how we might be able to go about that, and people could participate in that, Claire, if you're open to that.
Awesome.
And then also your book that you just mentioned that you've just completed. What's the name of that again?
Sure. My book is called Social Media Success for Every Brand. And it's a book about how you can use social media finally in a way that works to grow your brand presence and connect with your potential customers and followers.
Okay, super. And it'll be on Amazon?
Yep. It's on Amazon. It comes out on October 22nd.
Okay, so everybody stay tuned and go to Amazon and buy this book. That'll be great.
Yeah.
One last question for you, Claire. Our time has gone far, far too fast. And so one last question for you, and that is, what are you most grateful for that has really shaped your career?
What am I most grateful for that has really shaped my career? Wow. I think I'm most grateful for the deep mentors that I've had along the way. I think without some of those mentors, I certainly would not be where I am, but more importantly, it would not have been as smooth of a journey, or I would not have been able to, pick myself back up after some of the kind of failures and mishaps along the way. So I would say my mentors.
Who are some of those mentors for you?
Sure. So Ken Blanchard is a great mentor. He and I wrote a book together called 1 Minute Mentoring, based off of some of our mentoring relationship and also helping others to learn how to mentor one another's. Another great mentor of mine is the thinker and writer Whitney Johnson. She's been an incredible support to me. Another mentor is Kirsten Stewart, a technology executive who has guided me along the way. So those are just a few of them.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your story, for what you're doing, the work you've done. You are just so amazing. And we will let everybody know as we move forward and keep thinking about this issue of ethics, because it is huge. Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for listening to Building My Podcast, or my Legacy podcast today. If you have questions and would like to connect with Claire, just let us know and we will make that connection for you. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Building My Legacy podcast with Dr. Lois Sonstegard. To book your appointment with Dr. Sonstegard, visit www.buildtomorrow.com.